he is. Oh my goodness, that's a big one. Stay on there, Brady. Now that is a Champlain stud right there, dude. That is a beast of a fish. I love that bite on that worm. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Technique of the Month video for August. We went through picking 4 baits for this month, and most of these were kind of with this technique in mind, to be quite honest. And the technique for this month is isolated cover, isolated targets, whichever one of those you want to call this, but especially isolated cover. You know, when I'm thinking about that, to me, that and August just really go hand in hand. And I feel like that may surprise some people, especially given that I'm talking about those isolated targets being in shallow water. You know, August for me is a time of the year when I typically get away from that deep stuff. A lot of that stuff has been beat on all summer long. And those fish, you may be able to graph them, you may be able to see them, but man, making them bite sometimes can be really, really hard. And this can be a time to buck that trend and go to really shallow water, even water that's very hot. I mean, I've caught a lot of fish in August in water that's up in the 90s, and as far as the water temperature goes. And is it ideal? No. But is it a way to catch fish? Yeah. So it's kind of what you got to do that time of the year sometimes just to be able, you know, to generate bites. So these 3 baits to me are you know, kind of cover top, middle, bottom. Okay. Of being able to fish this technique and be able to, you know, catch fish that are doing this. I mentioned that for me, this is primarily a shallow water deal. Just how shallow am I talking? I'm talking anywhere from inches to 4 or 5 feet, maybe, you know, somewhere in that range would kind of be the max depth when I'm thinking about this technique. You certainly could apply it to brush piles with the Texas rig out in, you know, 8 or 10 feet of water, but what I'm talking about here primarily is a very shallow water deal is what I'm going to be fishing a lot of those places with. Some of those are actually so shallow that, I mean, you could throw the Texas rig, you know, at those. I guess you could throw a crankbait around some of them, but some of these kind of places where I'm talking about truly are so shallow you almost have to throw a topwater bait. You know, something like a buzz bait for me, that black buzz bait, buzz toad, whichever you want to call that, is going to be the most effective just because those fish are so shallow. You know, when a bass is in this much water, it doesn't take a lot of effort for him to come up and eat something that's on the surface. It's probably actually easier for him to do that than it would be to go down and pin something on the bottom. And certainly very hard to get a crankbait that's going to run anywhere in between, you know, those two. So that's when that buzz bait can really be super effective, is on those really, really shallow isolated targets. Just a quick little memory that come back when I'm talking about that. We used to fish a lot of evening tournaments, and I can remember fishing one. I think it might have been a Wednesday evening tournament with my dad on Fort Loudon. We were up in Little River, a place that's got a lot of good shallow isolated cover, wood out on flats and stuff, and he throws a buzz bait over a log that, like I said, is in about this much water, hooks one, it comes up and jumps, you know, it looks like about a 3-pounder. I grab the net and I'm getting ready, you know, so I go over to the side of the boat and I go to put the net down in the water, right, to get underneath the fish. I go, hit the bottom because it's this deep. I was trying to get the net down underneath down under the water far enough to be able to get it under that fish. Well, it didn't take very far to get that net underwater or to hit the bottom because it just wasn't very much water there to start with. I think the boat was actually sitting on the bottom where we caught that one. But that's how shallow I'm talking. That can be really good, and that's where those places where that buzz bait is just the one to go with. Next would be tiny. You know, for a lot of that piece of wood that's out in that, you know, 1 to 3 foot kind of stuff, bouncing a little flat-sided crankbait through there can work really well at triggering a reaction bite. A big thing with tiny, more so than the buzz bait, is I'm going to make multiple casts by a piece of cover with that crankbait. With a topwater like a buzz bait, I'm gonna throw, you know, to the stump end of the log, I'm gonna throw out in the limbs, maybe one down the side, and I'm gonna move on if that's what I'm throwing. But with the crankbait, I'm gonna make multiple casts at the same piece, you know, just the root ball. I'm gonna hit it from 2 or 3 different angles, making the same cast multiple times. And I can't tell you how many times I've done that. And on the 4th, 5th, 10th cast by a piece of cover, generated a fish to bite. Was that fish sitting there the whole time and I finally triggered it to bite? Or was that fish wandering around the cover and it kept hearing something over there and it came in and then it finally bit? I have no idea. All I know is that multiple casts by a piece of cover with a crankbait a lot of times can generate a bite when you're fishing this technique. The final one would be that Texas rig. I don't have the sinker on there, but I would fish this with a 3/16 ounce sinker on there, pegged with a bobber stopper. That's that Bass Pro Magnum Finesse worm you saw in the Pick 4, that new VMC prototype hook. But that's gonna be the deal. If those fish just do not want to chase whatsoever, or maybe that piece of wood's a little bit deeper, something that I can flip in there, and even places that are just too snaggy, places I can't get the crankbait through, you know, it's a little bit too deep for the buzz bait, or it's just the time of day when those fish just don't want to chase and I need to drop something on their nose. That's gonna be the bait that I try to do that with. To me, an ideal situation where this technique would really play would be, regardless of the body water, it doesn't matter. If it's Lake Lanier in Georgia, if it's Douglas Lake here in East Tennessee, if it's Lake Champlain up in New York, what I'm looking for is an area that's got flats, and then it's got a piece of cover that's sitting, honestly, a long ways off the bank. Sometimes the further the better. And I think that's for multiple reasons. More so than anything, I think a piece of cover that's out away from everything else. You know, if you imagine like this table here, it's just a big expansive flat. Nothing really else out there going on. You've got one tree or one something in the middle of it. For one, that's a magnet. I mean, that's the only shady place there. There's nothing else going on. Number 2, if it's out in the middle of that area, if the wind blows north, south, east, west, or any current flows in any direction, it's going to flow across that piece of cover coming from somewhere. So you've got the fact that it's kind of a, you know, kind of an oasis almost in that desert land where there's nothing else going on, as well as the fact that anything that moves in any direction is going to push some water around that piece of cover, and a bass can move around it somewhere and be able to set up in an ambush kind of spot. So I think that's why this technique is so effective, and why in August, you know, those fish just kind of move to those areas. It's kind of a safe haven. They're away from a lot of other stuff, and truthfully, a lot of fishermen pass them up. They'll be riding down the lake. They want to pull up on a bank, be able to drop the trolling motor, and fish 100 yards, 200 yards down this shoreline. They don't want to run over here, drop the trolling motor to fish one log that's 10 feet long. They just don't want to do it. It's not worth the effort, in their opinion, you know, to pull over there and drop the trolling motor and fish for 4 or 5 minutes to pull the trolling motor up and run to the next spot. But those isolated pieces of cover are just magnets a lot of times to the bass, and this is a great time of year to really make hay off of them. So I encourage you, get out there and try that this month in August. Man, I know it can be hot, but you can definitely catch some really good fish. And like I mentioned in the Pick 4 video, that buzz bait on an isolated piece of cover in the back of a creek on Fort Loudon, that was where I caught my biggest fish ever on that particular lake. So it doesn't take a lot of cover, it doesn't take a lot of depth, and you can catch a really big one out there this month.